Welcome to our tutorial about setting up Cubase for working with MIDI. In this tutorial, we'll be learning how to configure Cubase to receive your MIDI signal. This means we're going to tell Cubase which devices to use. First, be sure you've connected your MIDI device to your MIDI interface properly and that they're powered up before you launch Cubase. In Cubase, you configure MIDI port setup in the Device Setup dialog window. Let's select Devices, and then Device Setup. Select MIDI port setup from the Devices tree on the left. When you change your MIDI port settings in this window, they're applied automatically elsewhere throughout Cubase. Let's resize this window a little bit. If your MIDI interface appears on the right, that means Cubase has scanned and successfully recognized your device. You can disable MIDI ports by unchecking the visible box. You can also rename your ports. Just click in the Show As column and type your new name. Press Enter when you're done. If you don't see your MIDI interface in this list, that means Cubase can't see it either. So be sure your drivers are properly installed and that the interface is powered up. Make sure your external instrument and your interface were powered up before you launched Cubase. Check your FireWire connections and your USB connections as well. When you record MIDI, you can specify which input the track should use, or you can select the In All Inputs option for an input port. This means, actually, let me just adjust the window size here. Then I can stretch out the page a little more. Here's the In All Inputs column. Selecting this option means that any MIDI data from any MIDI input will be recorded. The In All Inputs option on the MIDI port setup page lets you choose which to include. This is handy if your system shows numerous instances of the same physical MIDI input. One caveat: if you've got a MIDI remote control unit connected, deactivate the In All Inputs option for that input so that you don't accidentally record data from the remote control. Under File, Preferences on a Windows platform. Actually, let me close this window first. Click OK. Now let's go to File, Preferences on a Windows platform, or under the Cubase menu on a Mac, there's a setting called MIDI through Active. Let's scroll down to the MIDI branch of the Preferences tree. Ensure that MIDI through Active is checked. You should also set your instrument to Local Control Off. See your instrument's operating manual for details about how to do this. MIDI through Active means that the MIDI signal from the keyboard will be recorded in Cubase and at the same time rerouted back to your keyboard so that you can hear what you're playing. In other words, the MIDI data is immediately echoed back out. If you aren't able to set your instrument to Local Off, then you should deactivate MIDI through in Cubase. MIDI through will be active for MIDI tracks that are record enabled and/or have the monitor button activated. Click OK to apply your changes. And this concludes our tutorial about configuring MIDI port setup within Cubase.